They called her damaged goods. They whispered she wasn't worthy of a decent man. They stared at her burned hands like she was something broken that should have stayed hidden. But what this town didn't know, what they couldn't see beneath those scars, would bring every single one of them to their knees. If you've ever been judged before you had a chance to speak, if you've ever walked into a room and felt the air shift against you, stay with me. This is a story about what happens when the person everyone pities turns out to be the one person everyone needed. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The wagon came in just before noon when the sun hung low and pale over the ridge and the wind carried the kind of cold that didn't ask permission before it found your bones. It wasn't a grand entrance. There was no music, no crowd gathered with flowers or warm words, just the creak of wagon wheels on frozen ground, the reluctant huff of two tired horses, and the driver, old Pete Calloway, who ran mail and passengers between Hargrove Station and the surrounding homesteads, pulling the reins back with all the enthusiasm of a man delivering something he wasn't sure anyone actually wanted. Black Ridge Ranch sat at the edge of everything. That was the honest way to describe it. To the north, a wall of pine-covered ridgeline blocked the horizon like a closed door. To the south, the land rolled out flat and brown for miles before it gave up and became someone else's problem. The main house was 2 stories, built solid but not pretty, with a covered porch that had seen better decades and a roof that had been patched in at least 4 different places with 4 different kinds of material. A working ranch, not a showpiece. 3 men stood near the fence post when the wagon arrived. They'd been fixing a section of split rail that had collapsed sometime in the night, or pretending to at least. The moment the wagon slowed, the hammering stopped. Cleet, who was 23 and talked more than he worked, leaned against the post with his thumbs in his belt. "That her?" Dooley, twice his age and half as talkative, squinted toward the wagon. "Reckon so." "Huh." Cleet tilted his hat back. "Didn't picture her like that." Nobody had, really. Maren Holloway stepped down from that wagon like a woman who had learned a long time ago that the ground didn't always meet your foot where you expected it to. She was careful, deliberate. She tested her footing before she committed her weight, gripping the wagon's side panel as she descended. The grip itself was what drew the eye, or rather, what the grip revealed. Her hands. The left one was worse than the right. The skin across the back of it was drawn tight and uneven, the kind of surface that looked less like flesh and more like something that had melted and reset wrong. The fingers weren't deformed exactly. They worked, all of them, but the way the scar tissue pulled along the knuckles made it impossible to look at without your own hands wanting to curl inward, like they were embarrassed on her behalf. She was maybe 30, dark-haired, brown-eyed, average height. Her dress was clean but plain, dark gray wool that had probably been the respectable choice for a long journey, but had lost the argument somewhere around the 3rd day of travel. She wore gloves, or had worn them. She'd removed them at some point, and they were stuffed in the pocket of her coat, as if she'd been hiding them and then decided, quietly and privately, to stop. She stood beside the wagon and looked at the ranch without expression. Not awe, not disappointment, just looking, taking inventory. Pete climbed down from the driver's bench and hauled her trunk from the back, a single wooden trunk, not large, and set it in the dirt with a grunt. "This is the place, ma'am. Black Ridge." He paused. "Mr. Callum Voss's property." "I know," she said. Her voice was steady, not loud. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway." Pete nodded, looked at her hands once without meaning to. The way people did, the involuntary glance that they always regretted a half-second too late, and then made himself busy with the horses. The 3 ranch hands hadn't moved. Maren picked up her own trunk, or tried to. It was heavier than she'd managed alone before, and for a moment the thing barely shifted, and she had to adjust her grip twice before she found a way to hold it that worked with her hands. She didn't ask for help. She didn't look at them. Dooley nudged Cleet with his elbow. Cleet hesitated, not out of meanness, though it probably looked that way, but because he genuinely didn't know what to do. Offer help and maybe offend her. Don't offer and look like a brute. He stood there 1 second too long making that calculation, and in that second Maren had shifted the trunk under her arm and was walking toward the porch. "She's really just gonna—" Cleet started. "Shut up," said Dooley, and went back to the fence rail. The inside of the house told a story that the outside had only hinted at. Marin set her trunk down in the entryway and stood quietly for a moment, letting her eyes adjust. The front room was large enough. Stone fireplace, a long table, 4 mismatched chairs, a settee with one cushion that had given up trying to remain attached. A staircase against the left wall led to the upper floor. There was a coat rack with too many coats for the number of people who lived here, which meant it hadn't been sorted in a long time. Maybe since the death. Probably since then. The kitchen was visible through a wide doorway to the right, and that was where Marin went first. Not because she was told to, but because she could smell what the kitchen was trying to hide. Sour milk, old grease, something that had been cooked in a pan that hadn't been properly cleaned in at least a week, possibly longer. The kitchen was large by frontier standards, which meant it was functional but brutal. A cast iron stove that dominated the far wall and hadn't been blacked in some time. A work table in the center, scarred with decades of use. Dry goods stacked on open shelves in no particular order. Sacks of flour and cornmeal shoved beside tins of lard. A string of onions that had mostly gone soft. A jar of molasses with the rim crusted over. The butter churn in the corner still had yesterday's cream in it, or possibly the day before's. Marin stood in the center of the kitchen and turned slowly, once. Her face didn't change. She opened the firebox of the stove. Cold. She checked the wood box beside it. Half full. At least someone had kept up with that much. She picked up the pan sitting on the stove's surface, looked at the residue baked into it, set it back down. "That's my kitchen." The voice came from the doorway. Marin turned. Eleanor Briggs was a solid woman. Not tall, but built in a way that suggested she didn't move unless she meant to. She was somewhere in her middle 50s, with gray-streaked hair pinned severely at the back of her head and a face that had been handsome once and had decided to settle into capable instead. She wore an apron that said more about her than any introduction could. It was flour-dusted, practical, and slightly damp at the waistline from what looked like actual work this morning. She was Callum Voss's late wife's aunt. She had come to help when Clara Voss died 18 months ago, and she had not left. She stood in that doorway and looked at Marin the way a woman looks at something that has appeared in her space without being invited. "I'm Marin," Marin said. She didn't extend her hand. She'd learned over the years that offering the hand was an invitation for the eyes to go somewhere she didn't want them to go. "Marin Holloway, or Voss, I suppose, as of this morning." "As of this morning," Eleanor repeated like she was testing the words for structural integrity. "Callum's in the north field. He won't be back until supper." "All right." I managed the house. "I see that," Marin said, and she said it without judgment, though Eleanor's chin came up anyway. "Clara?" His wife. "Clara trusted me with this house. She had good judgment then." Eleanor waited for the rest of the sentence, the part where Marin said but or however or things will change now. It didn't come. Marin was looking at the shelves again. "The molasses jar needs a new lid," Marin said, "and that butter's been sitting too long. If it hasn't turned already, it will by tomorrow morning." Eleanor looked at the butter churn, looked back at Marin. "I know how to manage butter." "I didn't say you didn't." The silence that followed was the kind that decides things. Eleanor untied her apron and folded it over the back of the nearest chair. "Supper's at 6, she said, and walked out of the kitchen. What? Marin had been given the attic room. This was not stated cruelly. It was simply the room that was available, or rather, the room that had been made available, since there were arguably 2 or 3 rooms on the upper floor that sat empty and unused but which nobody had offered. She didn't ask. She took the attic room, which had a low ceiling and a single window that faced north and let in the cold in intimate and personal ways, and she unpacked her trunk. It didn't take long. She wasn't a woman who kept much. A change of clothes, a coat heavier than the one she wore, a small tin that had once held tobacco and now held something else, 3 buttons, a short piece of ribbon, a folded note worn thin at the creases, a knife with a handle wrapped in leather cord, a book, dog-eared and cracked at the spine, that had been read so many times the title on the cover was no longer legible, and her kit. She unwrapped it carefully from the cloth she kept it in. 6 tins of different sizes, labeled in her own handwriting. A small glass vial of something amber. Dried herbs in paper packets, each one rolled and sealed with a twist. A mortar, small enough to fit in her palm, its pestle worn smooth. These she set on the small shelf above the room's single piece of furniture, a narrow bed with a mattress that had seen harder years than her. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her hands. The right one wasn't bad, if you knew how to look at it. The scar ran from the base of her thumb across the back of the hand and stopped at the wrist, as if whatever had burned her had been interrupted partway through. The left was different. The left had gotten the worst of it, the full heat, and the skin there had required more work from the healers who'd treated her and had given back less. Some mornings the left hand stiffened, and she had to work it open slowly, carefully, bending each finger with patient deliberateness until the joints loosened. She did that now, sitting in the cold attic room of a strange man's house on the first afternoon of what was technically her marriage. She had not yet met her husband. Callum Voss came in at 6:20, 18 minutes after the rest of the household had already sat down at the table. He was a larger man than she'd expected, not in the way of excess, but in the way of a man who worked hard with his body and whose body had simply grown to accommodate that. Wide through the shoulders, with hands that carried the evidence of the last 15 years across every knuckle and callus. He was 41, she knew from the letter, and he looked it honestly, weathered at the eyes, carrying weight in his jaw that hadn't been there in his 30s, with dark hair shot through with early gray at the temples. He came in through the back door, which led into the kitchen, and stopped when he saw Maren standing at the stove. She heard the door and turned. They looked at each other for a moment, both of them conducting the same quiet assessment that the letters had never quite prepared either of them for. "Mr. Voss," she said. "Mrs." He stopped, cleared his throat. "Maren." He said it like he was trying the name on. "I apologize for the hour." "The North Field. It's giving me trouble." Eleanor mentioned. He looked at her hands. She watched him look, and she kept her face even because she'd had long enough to practice that particular expression. The brief flicker, the decision not to say anything, the shift of the eyes back up to her face. "I got your letters," he said. "I got yours." He nodded, took his hat off. "How was the journey?" "Long, fine." She turned back to the stove. "There's food. The biscuits are already on the table. I was keeping the soup warm." "You didn't have to." Eleanor managed supper. "I only kept it warm." A pause. "Right," he said. "Right then." He went to wash his hands at the basin, and she carried the pot from the stove, and they both moved through the kitchen with the careful choreography of people who didn't yet know each other's patterns, avoiding a collision less by instinct and more by paying close attention. Supper was quiet in the way that certain kinds of painful quiet are. Not peaceful, but suspended, like everyone at the table was holding a note they weren't quite ready to release. Callum sat at the head. Eleanor to his left, her spine perfectly vertical, her participation in the meal technically present, but emotionally withheld. Maren sat to his right. Across from her, Callum's son, Thomas, 15, who had her father's coloring and his mother's set to the mouth, kept his eyes on his food with the focused dedication of someone practicing invisibility. And then the empty chair. Maren didn't ask about the empty chair. She'd been told, in one of Callum's letters, written in the careful, measured tone of a man who didn't know how much to say. "My daughter, Lucy, 8 years old. She hasn't been well since her mother passed." The chair at the corner of the table, beside Thomas, sat with a plate that had been set and then abandoned. The food on it was untouched and cold. "She won't come down," Thomas said, and it wasn't directed at anyone in particular. "She doesn't have to," Callum said. His voice was level, but there was something underneath it, some compressed thing. "She should eat." "Tom." "She barely ate yesterday either, or the day before." "Thomas." Firmer now. Thomas pushed his spoon around his bowl. "I'm just saying." "I know what you're saying." Eleanor set down her biscuit. "I've been bringing a tray up. She takes a little." "A little," Thomas repeated, like the word had a taste he didn't like. Maren ate her soup. She listened. She didn't offer anything. No solution, no reassurance, no comment about what could be done or how she might help. She was the newest thing in this house by a significant margin, and she understood, with the practical intelligence of someone who had spent years reading rooms, that the worst thing she could do right now was speak. After supper, when Eleanor had cleared the dishes, and Thomas had disappeared upstairs, and Callum had gone back out to check on something in the barn, Marin washed the pot she'd used to keep the soup warm. She washed it properly. Not rinsed, washed, with the brush, and set it to dry, and then she climbed the stairs to the attic. She passed the upper hallway. One of the doors was not quite closed, a thin line of light. She stopped. She didn't open the door. She stood outside it for a moment, just existing in the hallway, and then she said quietly and without drama, "Good night," to the light under the door, and continued up to the attic. No response came. She hadn't expected one. The ranch hands had opinions. This was inevitable. Give a group of men a new and unexpected development, and opinions were going to form whether the facts supported them or not. There were 5 of them: Dooley and Cleet, who'd seen her arrive; Miguel, who was 26 and methodical and rarely wrong about things; Hank, the oldest at 58, who'd worked for Callum's father before he'd worked for Callum, and a young man everyone called Rook because nobody had ever bothered to learn his actual name, including, eventually, Rook himself. They ate their meals separately, in the bunkhouse, though Eleanor would send food over. The morning after Marin's arrival, while they worked the fence line and the day was still iron gray and cold, the conversation found her. "Burned hands," Cleet said. "The whole back of both of them." "We know," said Miguel. "We were there." "Just saying." "You say a lot." Miguel drove a post stake without looking up. "Doesn't make it mean something." "I'm just saying Callum deserves better than..." "Better than what?" Dooley asked. He asked it simply, no heat in it. "Better than a woman who made it here when a lot of other women backed out? Better than someone willing to take this place on?" Cleet didn't answer immediately. "It's just strange is all. Something happened to her hands like that." "Things happen to people," Hank said. He was sharpening a blade on the fence post, long, slow strokes, not looking at either of them. "That's not exactly news. But we don't know what." "No," Hank agreed. "We don't. She just walked in there and didn't say nothing, didn't introduce herself to anyone, I don't know, she's strange." "She's careful," Miguel said. "What's the difference?" Miguel looked up. Careful is what people get when they've been hurt for showing themselves. Strange is what other people call it when they don't want to think about why. Cleet processed this for a moment, then returned to his work without responding. She began with the kitchen, not dramatically, not by announcing a program of renovation or presenting a list of demands. She simply began. The first morning she was up before anyone else, which in a working ranch meant before 5 in the morning, and the kitchen had a fire going and the stove was hot by the time Eleanor came downstairs to start the day's first bread. Eleanor stopped in the doorway. The work table had been cleared and wiped down. The molasses jar had been transferred to a clean container. Marin had found an empty one on the second shelf and washed it the night before. The softened onions were gone, and in their place a braided strand of the remaining good ones hung from the hook Eleanor had never gotten around to using. The butter churn had been cleaned. Eleanor stood in the doorway and looked at all of this. "I didn't touch the dough things," Marin said from where she stood at the stove with a pan. "I didn't know where you keep your starter." "Third shelf," Eleanor said slowly. "The crock with the cloth lid." "I thought that might be it. I left it." A pause. "There's a rhythm to this kitchen," Eleanor said. "A way things are done." "I expect so." Marin moved the pan off the direct heat. "I'm not trying to change your rhythm. I can't sit still in a dirty kitchen. It's a problem I have." Eleanor looked at the onions on the hook. "Those were getting soft. The ones at the ends, mostly. I pulled them. The middle ones are fine yet." There was something struggling across Eleanor's face. 2 things, actually. The part of her that resented the intrusion, and the part of her that had been quietly overwhelmed for 18 months and knew it and had been exhausted by it. The second part won, temporarily, and she crossed to the third shelf and pulled the crock with the cloth lid. "Breakfast is biscuits on weekdays," she said, setting the crock on the table. "Pancakes on Sundays if there's enough egg." "I know a good biscuit," Marin said. Eleanor made a sound that might have been agreement and might have been skepticism, and started her bread. The first meal that was truly Marin's came on the 3rd day. Dinner, the midday meal, had been her responsibility at Claire's direction in better times, Eleanor explained, And now that Marin was here, Eleanor was willing to relinquish it. The word willing carried its full weight. Marin had spent the previous afternoon in the cellar and the dry goods, doing the quiet arithmetic that good cooking required before a pot was ever heated. What was here? What was in short supply? What could be stretched and what couldn't? She made a beef and root vegetable stew. This sounds ordinary, and from a distance it was the kind of meal that everyone on a frontier ranch made in October. But Marin made it differently. She rendered the fat from the beef first, in the pan, and built the base of the stew in that fat so the flavor carried through from the beginning rather than being added in at the end. She used 3 different roots: the turnips that were soft at the edges but fine inside, the parsnips that nobody had thought to use, the last of the carrots. And she cut them differently so they cooked at different rates, and the finished stew had textures, not just one texture. She added something from one of her small tins, just a pinch, rubbed between her fingers before it went in. And the kitchen smelled different afterward. Not fancy, just alive. Cleet was the first to say something, which was predictable, since Cleet always said something. "What's in this?" "Beef and roots," Marin said, from where she stood at the work table doing something else. "Yeah, but it's different." "Is it bad different?" He considered his bowl. "No." "Then you're fine." Hank ate 2 servings, which was the most reliable compliment in the world, because Hank had eaten every imaginable version of frontier cooking for 58 years, and his palate had opinions even if his mouth didn't. Miguel, passing the kitchen doorway with a bucket of something, paused long enough to say, "That smells incredible," and kept going. Callum came in for dinner, which he didn't always manage. The ranch's needs were unpredictable, and meals had suffered for it. He sat down, tasted the stew without comment, and ate steadily. When he finished, he set his spoon down. "This is good," he said. Marin was at the stove and didn't turn around. "Good. I mean," he paused. "Clara used to... The stew she made was..." He stopped. The kitchen held its breath. "I don't know what I'm trying to say," he said. "You don't have to say anything," Marin said. Her voice was easy, careful. "It's just dinner." He was quiet for a moment. "Right," he said. "Right." But he didn't leave immediately, which told its own story. Matin. The day Marin found Lucy was an accident on both their parts. She'd gone looking for the cellar inventory. There was a book, Eleanor had mentioned, a ledger where Clara had tracked the preserves and dry goods put up each season. Eleanor thought it might be on the shelf in the back hallway. Marin went to look and found, instead of a ledger, a small girl sitting on the floor of the hallway with her back against the wall and her knees drawn up and her eyes on Marin like an animal that hadn't decided yet whether to run. Lucy Voss was 8 years old and looked younger. She had her father's dark coloring and her mother's something. It was in the shape of her face, the particular proportion of eyes to cheekbone that wasn't quite Callum's and must have been Clara's. She was thin in the way that was past normal and approaching concerning, and her hair was slightly matted at the back, the way it got when someone wasn't sleeping flat or wasn't being tended regularly. She was wearing 2 wool socks and no shoes, and one of the socks had a hole in the toe. She and Marin looked at each other. "Hello," Marin said. She kept her voice exactly the same as it always was. No special softness, no exaggerated warmth. Just, hello. Lucy said nothing. "I'm looking for the household ledger, the inventory book. Your Aunt Eleanor said it might be back here." Lucy's eyes moved to Marin's hands and stayed there. Not with horror, exactly, with the frank, unfiltered curiosity of a child who had not yet learned that staring was rude or who had learned and decided it didn't apply here. "What happened?" she said. Marin didn't pretend not to know what she meant. "Fire," she said. "A long time ago." "Does it hurt?" "Not anymore. It did when it happened." "Does it look bad?" Marin considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think so sometimes. Other times I forget about it. Mostly I just notice that my left hand doesn't like cold weather." Lucy seemed to find this acceptable. She looked at the hands a moment longer and then looked at Marin's face. "I'm Lucy." "I know, I'm Marin." "I know," Lucy said. "You're the new one." "I am." A long pause. "You're not going to try to make me eat," Lucy said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't combative. It was more like a statement of terms. "No," Marin said. "Everyone tries to make me eat. I expect they're scared for you." Another pause. Lucy pulled her sock foot a little closer. "I'm not hungry." "That can happen," Marin said. "When something hurts a lot." She found the ledger on the opposite shelf. As it turned out, Eleanor had misremembered, and she took it and left the hallway. She didn't tell anyone she'd spoken to Lucy. She simply went back to the kitchen and started making a list of what needed to be restocked before the first hard frost. The injury that revealed her happened in the second week. Rook, the young ranch hand, caught his arm on a rusted piece of equipment in the equipment shed. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was a bad gash running from elbow to mid-forearm, bleeding in a way that made everyone around him start talking too loud and moving without a plan. Dooley brought him to the porch. Callum was across the property. Eleanor was at the neighbors 2 miles east for some ongoing exchange involving a borrowed piece of harness. The men stood around Rook with a rag they were pressing to the wound, with the general confidence of people who knew this needed to be done and were less certain about everything after. Marin came out of the house. She looked at the wound. She asked Rook directly, "Can you move the fingers?" Yeah, it just... Move them." He did. She watched. "Okay," she said. "Come inside." Eleanor usually does the... Eleanor's gone. Come inside. Cleet started to say something about sending for the doctor in Hargrove. "This doesn't need a doctor," Marin said, without looking at him. "It needs to be cleaned properly and closed. He'll lose half a day of work, not an arm." She said it so plainly that nobody argued. In the kitchen, with Rook sitting at the work table looking pale, Marin went to her room and came back with her kit. She unwrapped it on the table and went to work with an economy of motion that came from having done this kind of thing many, many times. She cleaned the wound, which was the part that made Rook go pale around the mouth, and she did it methodically and without apology. She wasn't cruel, but she didn't baby it either. "You're going to have to hold still," she said. "I know it's bad. Hold still anyway." Rook held still. She used something from one of the small tins. She explained it without being asked, because she'd learned that unexplained things scared people. A salve. Something that helped prevent the festering. She closed the wound with neat, careful stitches, her scarred hands moving with a precision that made everyone in the doorway go quietly still. Cleet, watching from the doorway, said nothing for once. When it was done, she bandaged it, told Rook what to watch for over the next few days, told him to come to her if it showed any red spreading from the edges, and sent him off with a piece of bread and a cup of something warm from the pot she'd had going. The men stood on the porch afterward. "Where'd she learn all that?" Rook asked, looking at the bandage. "Don't know," Dooley said. "It's better than what the Hargrove doctor does," Miguel said. "And I've had both, so..." Hank watched the kitchen window, where Marin's shadow was visible, putting her kit away. "She's been someone's help," he said quietly. "For a long time, I think." Nobody disagreed. Miguel. That night, Callum found a reason to linger in the kitchen after supper. He'd developed a habit of it. Not always, not obviously, but gradually, over the 2 weeks since her arrival, there were more evenings where he found something that needed doing near the kitchen while Marin finished the cleaning up. She knew he was there. She wasn't sure he knew she knew. "Rook says you stitched him up," he said from the vicinity of the coat rack by the back door. "Yes, you've done that kind of thing before." It wasn't quite a question. "Yes," she said. He seemed to be choosing. "In the situation you came from." She wrung out the dishcloth, hung it on the hook. "I came from a lot of different situations, Mr. Voss. Most of them involved someone needing something and me being the nearest person who could provide it." A pause. "Callum," he said. "You should call me Callum." She didn't answer immediately. She dried her hands on the clean towel. The left hand first, working carefully at the spaces between the scarred knuckles. "Callum," she said, and the word sat in the kitchen for a moment, testing its own weight. "The children," he started, and then stopped. Tried again. "This has been hard for them." "I know." "Thomas especially. He was close with his mother." "I know." "You shouldn't take it personally if he..." "I don't," she said. He doesn't owe me anything. None of them do. I'm not here to replace someone. You can't replace someone. She said it simply, without self-pity or performance. I'm here to be useful. That's all I know how to do. Callum was quiet for a long moment. She heard him shift his weight. He favored his right side slightly, she'd noticed, an old injury or just a habit of long standing. And then he said, "Thank you, for Rook." "He'll be fine," she said. "Tell him to come to me in 3 days and I'll check it." He said goodnight and went upstairs. Marin finished in the kitchen and climbed to the attic. The wind had picked up and was arguing with the north-facing window again, and she lay in the narrow bed with her left hand curled against her chest, the way it preferred when the cold was coming in, and she listened to the house settle around her. She was not comfortable here yet, but comfort, she had learned a long time ago, was not the same thing as necessary. The moment that changed something, not everything, but something, came on a Tuesday evening near the end of October, when the frost had been hard 2 nights running and the smell of winter was no longer a warning but a promise. Marin had made soup, a simple one. Chicken broth she'd coaxed from a set of bones nobody had thought to use, with thin sliced potato and a handful of dried herbs from her own supply. It was warm and savory and smelled like something a person's body recognized before their brain did, something that reached into some older, wordless place and said safe and here and rest. She filled a bowl. She thought for a moment. She cut 2 fingers of bread and laid them on the side of the bowl. She added nothing else. No persuasion, no note, no announcement. She went upstairs. She knocked once, on the door that was usually not quite closed. No answer. She set the bowl on the floor in front of the door, the bread propped against the bowl to keep it from tipping. She went back downstairs. An hour later, she went upstairs to retrieve the tray. The bowl was empty. Marin stood in the hallway with the empty bowl in her scarred hands and let the fact of it sit in her chest for a moment. Then she went back to the kitchen, washed the bowl, and finished her evening. She did not tell anyone. She brought another bowl the following night, and the one after that. On the 4th night, the door was open 2 inches wider than it usually was when she came upstairs. Just 2 inches. Not an invitation exactly, more of a tentative crack. "Marin," said Lucy's voice from inside the room. She stopped. "Yes?" A pause. "It tastes like something." Marin waited. "Like something I remember," Lucy said. Marin thought about what to say and decided on the truth simply. "I'm glad," she said. The door didn't open further, but it didn't close either. Marin went back downstairs, and the night moved around the house. And somewhere in the north field, a coyote said something to the dark, and Black Ridge Ranch held itself together a little more than it had the night before. November came in without apology. The first real snow fell on a Wednesday, thin and mean, more ice than actual snow, and it coated every horizontal surface on the property with a layer that looked soft from a distance and was treacherous up close. Dooley slipped crossing from the bunkhouse to the barn and caught himself on the fence post, and the fence post caught him back with a splinter that went deep into his palm. Cleet managed to leave a gate unlatched in the east pasture, and 3 of the younger cattle got out and had to be rounded up in the dark and the cold by everyone available, including Callum, who came back in 2 hours later with his jaw set in a way that meant the day was a write-off. The snow wasn't even 2 inches deep before it had already caused 4 separate problems. Marin watched it come in from the kitchen window, her coffee going cold in her hand, and thought about what the cellar held and whether it was enough. She'd been running numbers in her head for the past week, the mental arithmetic of winter provisions, of how many mouths and how many weeks, and what the shortfalls were likely to be. The picture wasn't dire, but it wasn't comfortable either. She set the coffee down and went to find the household ledger. Eleanor found her at the kitchen table with the ledger open and a piece of paper beside it where Marin had been doing sums. "What's this?" Eleanor asked. "Inventory," Marin said. "I'm trying to figure out where we're short." Eleanor looked at the ledger, then at Marin's paper, then at Marin. "I know what's in the cellar." "I know you do. I'm not suggesting you don't." Marin turned the ledger so Eleanor could see it better. "The pork's going to run thin if we get a long winter. We've got less salt than I'd expected for this point in the season. And the apple stores are better than they look, but they need to be sorted. There are a few going soft in the back that'll take the whole crate with them if nobody pulls them." Eleanor sat down. She looked at the numbers. Something moved across her face that she didn't quite manage to conceal.
something that might have been relief if relief were willing to identify itself out loud. Clara kept better stores, she said. It wasn't defensive so much as honest. The first winter without her, I was managing other things. You were managing children, Marin said, and a grief-struck man, and a ranch that didn't stop needing things just because the woman who'd been running it was gone. Yes, Eleanor said. Just that. Yes. A pause settled between them. Not the cold kind. Not the first kind they'd shared in this kitchen. This one had more air in it. The apples, Eleanor said. I'll sort them this afternoon. I can do it. I know, I said I will. Eleanor pulled the ledger toward her. What are you thinking about the pork? And just like that, without ceremony or acknowledged truce, they began to work from the same page.
It wasn't friendship. It was something more functional and arguably more useful. Two competent women who had separately recognized that the household worked better when they weren't working against each other. The realization had come to Eleanor slowly over the weeks since Marin's arrival, through the accumulated evidence of small things. The way Marin had fixed the kitchen without dismantling Eleanor's role in it. The way she'd handled Rook's injury and then stepped back again, not claiming territory. The way she never, not once, told Eleanor what to do or how to do it. She simply did what needed doing and made room for Eleanor to do the same. It was a foreign way of operating, and Eleanor didn't entirely trust it yet, but she was practical enough to use it. The apple sorting happened that afternoon, the two of them in the cellar with a lantern between them and the temperature that of a root cellar in November, which is to say, unambiguous. Eleanor sorted with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done it many times. Marin sorted with the focused attention of someone who was also cataloging everything on the surrounding shelves. Neither of them talked much, but the silence was working silence, which is different from hostile silence in ways that matter. She was a good cook, Eleanor said, at one point, not looking up from the apples. Clara. I know, Marin said, which was half true. She knew it from the way the kitchen had been set up, from the tools kept and their arrangement, from the small marks in the cookbook that Clara had apparently owned and annotated in her careful hand. She didn't cook like you do, though. Marin waited. She was warmer about it, more instinct, less method. Eleanor found a soft spot in an apple, worked around it. What you do is more like someone trained. In a manner of speaking, Marin said. Were you? Eleanor glanced at her. Trained somewhere? By necessity, Marin said, and by a woman who didn't have much patience for doing things badly. Eleanor made a sound that might have been recognition. Who was she? Marin was quiet for a moment. The lantern between them swayed slightly in some draft that shouldn't have existed this far underground. She ran a boarding house, she said finally. In a town I lived in for a while. She was difficult and specific, and she knew things about cooking that I've never seen in any book. A pause. She didn't like me much at first. What changed her mind? Nothing dramatic, Marin said. I just kept showing up, and I didn't complain. And eventually she ran out of reasons to keep me at arm's length. Eleanor looked at her. Marin looked back. Something quiet was exchanged that neither of them named. The pork, Eleanor said. There's a family 3 miles north who usually has extra going into winter. The Hendersons. I could send word. That would help, Marin said. They went back to the apples. Thomas didn't warm to her. This was a fact Marin had accepted, or was in the process of accepting, which is different. He was 15, and he'd spent the last 18 months being the man of the house in all the ways that hurt. Holding himself steady while his father grieved, managing his own sorrow at a volume that wouldn't alarm Lucy, being old enough to understand everything that had happened, and young enough that understanding it was still new and raw. He'd been doing this long enough that the posture had become the person, and Marin was smart enough to know that you didn't dismantle that kind of armor by asking nicely. So she didn't try to dismantle it. She treated him the way she'd learned to treat most difficult things, consistently, without drama, and with a particular refusal to take his coldness personally that seemed to confuse him, which was perhaps the point. She left coffee on the kitchen table in the mornings, hot enough to be useful, and didn't comment when he took it. She asked him once if he knew anything about the north fence line that kept giving Callum trouble, and when he said yes, there was a section that had been bad since last spring. She listened to what he said and didn't dismiss it, And the next morning she told Callum what Thomas had said, by name. And Callum had gone to look at the exact section Thomas had described. She didn't announce that she'd done this. She didn't expect credit, but Thomas noticed. He wasn't oblivious. He was just guarded, and those are different things. One evening she came into the kitchen to find him at the work table, doing something with a piece of leather and a needle, repairing a bridle strap, as it turned out, and he looked up with the expression of someone prepared to be asked to leave. "You're fine," she said, going to the stove. "I just need the salt." He watched her get the salt and start on whatever she was making. She didn't look at him. He went back to the bridle. After a while he said, "The stitching on Rook's arm. He showed me." She stirred something. "Yes." "Where'd you learn that?" "Trial and error, mostly, and someone showed me years ago." "A doctor?" A woman who'd been a doctor's wife for 20 years and remembered more than he'd admitted to teaching her. She added something to the pot. She was in her 70s, and she had hands steadier than anyone I've ever known. Thomas considered this. "Rook said you didn't fuss about it." "Fussing doesn't close a wound." A pause. He pulled a stitch through the leather. He was scared. "I know. Most people are when they're bleeding." "You weren't." "I've been scared by other things," Marin said. "Blood doesn't particularly do it for me anymore." Thomas didn't say anything after that, but he also didn't leave, and he stayed at the work table until his bridal work was done, and the kitchen had 2 people in it who weren't exactly comfortable with each other but weren't performing discomfort either, and that was something. Not much, but something. The hardest part of that autumn was watching Callum carry what he carried and not knowing what, if anything, she was allowed to offer. She was his wife on paper, in the eyes of the law and the town, and in no other measurable way. They shared meals. They occasionally shared the same room for stretches of 20 minutes or more. He had treated her, from the first day, with a decency that she recognized as deliberate. He was making a point of being decent, which meant he was working at it, which meant there were moments when it cost him something. She didn't hold that against him. She understood the arithmetic of it. A man who had loved his wife and lost her, who had entered into a practical arrangement not because he'd stopped feeling things, but because the ranch and the children needed something he couldn't provide alone. There was no dishonesty in that. She'd understood it going in. But sometimes, in the evenings, she watched him sit by the fire with a mug going cold in his hand and his eyes on the middle distance, and she recognized the particular quality of that stillness, the way grief had a gravity all its own and pulled everything toward it, even thoughts you'd been trying to think about something else. She didn't say anything. She knew enough to know that unsolicited comfort was often just a bid for the other person's gratitude, and she wasn't interested in that transaction. But one evening, near the end of November, she sat down across from him, not beside him, not crowding him, just in the chair across the fire, and she took out the book she'd brought with her, and she read. And he sat with his cold mug. And the fire worked between them. And after a while he said, without looking up, "What are you reading?" "Something I've read before," she said. "I don't always need it to be new." He was quiet. Then, "What is it?" She tilted the cover toward him. He looked at it. "I don't know that one. It's not very well known. A woman wrote it. About the plains." She paused. "It's not happy exactly, but it's honest." He looked at the fire. Clara liked happy books. "Some people need that," Marin said. "Not a judgment either way." "I can't read them now," he said. "Can't read anything, really. I start a page and by the bottom of it I've got no idea what I just read." "That happens." "Does it stop?" She thought about it honestly. "I think it changes," she said. "I don't know if it stops." He looked at her. Actually at her. Not the quick, polite glance he usually managed, but a longer look, the kind where a person is trying to figure out what they're actually seeing. "You've lost someone," he said. "Yes." "Who?" A beat. She looked at her book. "More than one person," she said, "in different ways." He didn't press. That was one thing she'd come to appreciate about him. He asked direct questions, but he didn't dig when someone chose a closed door. He had his own closed doors. He understood the principle. "Thank you," he said, "for being here. I know it's not—" He seemed to lose the thread of what he was trying to say. "I know this isn't a regular situation." "Neither was the one I came from," Marin said. "I don't need regular." He almost smiled. It didn't quite complete itself, but the architecture was there. He picked up his mug, remembered it was cold, set it back down, and looked at the fire again. They sat like that for another half hour. She read her book. He sat with his thoughts. The fire was indifferent to both of them, which was its job, and the house was quiet around them in the way that quiet sometimes is when it's trying to be kind. Lucy ate. This deserves to be said plainly and with the weight it carried in the house. Lucy ate. Not a cautious bite, not the half a biscuit under duress that counted as victory in the weeks before Marin arrived. She ate. At first she ate the soup Marin left outside her door, and then she ate it with the door open 2 inches, and then one evening in mid-November, she appeared at the top of the stairs at 5:45 and came down to the kitchen. Marin heard her on the stairs. She didn't turn around. Lucy stood in the kitchen doorway with her sock feet and her recently somewhat less matted hair and looked at the stove with an expression that was working very hard at being nothing in particular and not entirely succeeding. "What is it?" she asked. "Chicken and dumplings," Marin said. "And there's bread." "Dumplings," Lucy said. "You don't have to eat them." "I know." A pause. "I like dumplings." "Good." Lucy came into the kitchen and sat at the table. Not the dining room. The kitchen table, the work table, where Marin was working. She sat and she watched, and Marin let herself be watched. And she did not make a big event of the fact that this child had just done something that her entire family had been hoping for and failing to achieve for 18 months. She set a bowl in front of Lucy. A real bowl. A full one. Lucy looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up her spoon. She ate the whole bowl. Then she sat with her hands in her lap and looked out the kitchen window at the dark. "My mama used to make this," Lucy said. Marin was at the stove. She kept her eyes there. "Did she?" "A little different. Hers had more, I don't know. It tasted like something hers had." "Dill, maybe," Marin said. "Or was it more savory?" "Like thyme." Lucy considered. The second one. Marin reached for one of her small tins. She opened it and held it out toward Lucy, not close enough to be in her space, just close enough for the smell to carry. "Is that it?" Lucy leaned forward and sniffed. Her face changed. Something came across it that was almost there and then went somewhere private very fast. "Yeah," she said. Her voice had gone smaller. "That's it." Marin closed the tin and set it on the work table. "I'll put some in next time," she said. "Easy. Ordinary." "Okay," said Lucy. The word dropped into the kitchen and stayed there, and for the rest of that evening Marin moved around the kitchen working, and Lucy sat at the table not quite ready to leave, and neither of them said anything that needed to be recorded, and the dumplings cooled in the pot, and outside the first real November dark pressed against the windows, and Black Ridge Ranch breathed in a way it hadn't in a long time. Callum found out at breakfast the next morning. Eleanor told him, not with ceremony, just stated it. Lucy came down for supper last night, and then went back to the bread she was turning. Callum put his coffee cup down very carefully and looked at the table for a moment, and then he looked at Marin. She met his eyes. She shook her head slightly. "Don't make it a thing." He understood. She could see him understand it, and she watched something in his face that was too complicated to name come and go. "Good," he said, just like that. "Good." And he picked up his coffee and drank it. But she noticed that morning that he took a longer route back from the barn than was strictly necessary, the one that went around the east side of the house, past the kitchen window. And she noticed that his pace was slightly slower than usual, the way a man walks when something in his chest is larger than normal and he's being careful with it. She didn't say anything about that either. Not all of November was quiet grace and small progressions. There were bad days. Of course there were. Cleet made a comment in the yard, not to Marin but clearly intended to be heard, about how Callum had his pick of women in Hargrove, and it was something he chose what came to him. Marin heard it from the porch. She kept walking. But later that day, when she was carrying water from the pump, she passed Cleet near the equipment shed, and she stopped. "You want to say it to my face," she said, "or you want to keep saying it to my back where you don't have to see whether it lands?" Cleet opened his mouth, closed it. "I don't mind which," she said. "I just want to know what I'm dealing with." She walked on. Cleet didn't say anything,
and he didn't make that kind of comment again within her hearing. And what he said or didn't say beyond her hearing she chose, consciously, not to spend energy on. Eleanor's moment came on a different day, and it was worse because it was less deliberate. She'd been going through the room that had been Clara's and Callum's, or had started to, sorting linens. And some particular smell or the angle of the afternoon light, or the simple accumulated weight of too many days carrying too much, broke through whatever Eleanor had been using to hold herself together. And Marin came upstairs to find her sitting on the edge of the bed in that room with her hands in her lap and her face in a state that she was trying to reassemble and couldn't. Marin stood in the doorway. She thought about leaving. It would have been the easier thing. Give Eleanor her privacy, let the moment pass, come back later as though she hadn't seen. But she stood there a moment longer and she said quietly, "You don't have to hold it together right now. There's nobody here but me." Eleanor looked up. Her eyes were red. She was not a woman who wept easily or showed it willingly, and the fact that she'd been caught in it made the expression on her face complicated in about 4 directions at once. "She was like a daughter to me," Eleanor said. "Clara was." "I know," Marin said. Not a replacement for her. I don't want you to think—" "I don't," Marin said. "I know what she was." Eleanor pressed her hands flat on her thighs. "I'm afraid," she said, and it sounded like the word cost her a significant amount. "Of what?" "That this family moves on and that she just becomes—" She stopped, couldn't finish it. Marin came into the room and sat in the chair by the window, not on the bed. "She's in how Lucy holds her spoon," she said. "She's in the way Callum pauses before he answers anything important, like he's listening to something first. She's in that kitchen, in what she built there, what she chose to keep and how she organized it." She paused. "Clara's not going anywhere. That's not how it works." Eleanor looked at her. "Nobody forgets a good woman," Marin said. "They just get further away from the sharpest part of it." It wasn't magic, and it wasn't the kind of comfort that fixed anything. Eleanor sat up straighter and pressed the backs of her wrists to her eyes. A quick, practical gesture, done with, and said, "The linens on the top shelf need sorting," which meant she was done with the conversation. Marin stood up and they sorted the linens, and that was that. But something had shifted between them. It wasn't visible, exactly. It was more like a temperature change, subtle, something you feel before you can name it. By the end of November, the kitchen was running in a way that made actual sense. Marin and Eleanor had worked out, without ever explicitly discussing it, a division that suited both their temperaments and their skills. Eleanor's bread was better than Marin's. There was a feel she had for it, an instinct about when the dough was right that Marin could learn but might never fully own the way Eleanor did. Marin's savory cooking was something Eleanor had stopped trying to replicate, because whatever Marin was doing with the smaller tins and the particular timing of things was beyond what a recipe could capture, and Eleanor was, at bottom, a practical woman who knew the boundaries of her own expertise. The meals that came out of Black Ridge Ranch's kitchen that November were better than they'd been in 2 years. The ranch hands knew it. Callum knew it. Thomas, who never said anything complimentary about anything, had started appearing in the kitchen doorway more often than was strictly accidental. And Lucy. Lucy came down for supper 5 nights out of 7, and then 6, and then she started appearing at breakfast. She sat at the table and she ate. Not always a lot, and not always with enthusiasm. There were mornings she poked at her food and didn't finish it, and Marin never mentioned those mornings. But she sat at the table. She was present. The color was coming back into her face by small degrees, the way color comes back in the weeks after winter. Gradual enough that you don't notice until one day you look and the gray is simply gone. Callum watched his daughter across the breakfast table one morning, and he thought he was being subtle about it. He wasn't. Lucy caught him looking. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You're staring." "I'm just—" He cleared his throat. "Nothing. Eat your breakfast." "I am eating my breakfast," Lucy said, with 8-year-old precision, and demonstrated by taking a bite. Marin, at the stove with her back to the room, allowed herself a small expression that nobody saw. Thomas saw it anyway, somehow, the way he saw most things. He looked at the back of Marin's head, and then at his father, and then at Lucy. Something moved in his face, complicated, private, not entirely unhappy. He looked back down at his own plate and said nothing, and ate his breakfast and took his coffee to go. Outside the kitchen window, the late November sky was the pale pewter of a season digging in, clouds bunched at the ridgeline, the kind of day that smelled like more snow before it was done. The work of the ranch went on the way it always did, indifferent to weather and grief and new beginnings alike, demanding what it demanded and taking what it took. The cattle needed feeding. The fences needed watching. The equipment that had broken and been half fixed needed properly fixing. But in the kitchen, over a cast iron stove that had been blacked for the first time in 2 years, something was happening that was harder to name than the work and more difficult to measure. It happened in small increments, the way most real things do. A shared ledger, sorted apples. A bowl of chicken and dumplings. A woman sitting with her grief on a made bed, while another woman who knew something about grief sat in the chair by the window and didn't leave. Eleanor, setting the bread to rise that evening, said, not looking at Marin, addressing the bread dough, "The Henderson family, they can spare the pork. I sent word this morning and they sent back yes." "Good," Marin said. "They'll bring it Friday." "I'll have the brine ready." Eleanor covered the dough and let it rest. She untied her apron, folded it, laid it over the chair. She was almost to the doorway when she paused. "The time," she said. "In the dumplings. Lucy asked me if we had more of it." Marin looked up. Eleanor didn't say anything else. She went upstairs. Marin stood in the kitchen with the lamplight and the smell of rising bread, and she thought about an 8-year-old girl asking for time because it was what her mother had used. She thought about how loss worked, how it didn't go away, but sometimes it changed shape into something you could almost hold. She opened her small tin, the one with the time, and she set it on the shelf where she kept the other things, where it could be found. The annual harvest supper had been a Black Ridge tradition long before Callum Voss owned the land. It went back to his father's time, maybe further, the kind of community gathering that frontier towns held on to because they needed reasons to be a community, and reasons were sometimes thin on the ground. Every year, somewhere between the last of the harvest and the first killing frost, the ranches and homesteads within riding distance of each other would gather at whoever had the largest table and eat together, and talk, and settle the small frictions that had accumulated over the working season into something that could get everyone through winter without open hostility. Black Ridge had hosted it twice in the last decade. This year, by some rotation of obligation that Callum hadn't fully anticipated when the season started, it was their turn again. He told Marin about it on a Thursday morning at the end of November, standing in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands in the way he had when he was about to say something he wasn't sure of. "The supper," he said. "It's the second Saturday of December." Marin looked up from the work table. "How many people?" 30, maybe 35, depends on weather, could be more. She did the arithmetic in her head. 35 people. A sit-down supper, 2 weeks. "All right," she said. He seemed to have been expecting something else. Negotiation, maybe, or a list of objections. He turned his hat a quarter turn. "Eleanor usually manages most of it. I don't want you to feel—" "I'll talk to Eleanor," Marin said. He stood there a moment longer. "The last few years," he said carefully, "the supper's it's been fine, nothing special. People didn't complain. But," he looked out the window, "Clara used to make it something. People talked about it for weeks after." He paused. "I'm not asking you to do that. I just—" "Callum," she said, and he looked at her. "I'll talk to Eleanor." He put his hat on and went back to work. Eleanor's response, when Marin found her, was more complicated. She sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she didn't drink and looked at the window for a moment before she said anything. "Clara planned the supper for months," she said. "She kept a notebook for it. What worked, what didn't. She started in September." "Do you still have the notebook?" Eleanor looked at her. "Yes." "Can I see it?" A pause. Eleanor got up, went to the back hallway, and came back with a small hardcover notebook, its cover stained at one corner from something long dried. She set it on the table between them with the particular care of someone setting down something fragile. Marin opened it. Clara Voss's handwriting was small and neat with occasional scrawls in the margins where enthusiasm had overtaken precision. Recipe notes, quantities adjusted, a list of what had run out before the evening was done and needed doubling next year. There were sketches of how the tables had been arranged, a pressed leaf at one page,
its purpose no longer apparent, but its presence intentional. Marin turned the pages slowly. Eleanor watched her do it. She had good instincts, Marin said. She did, Eleanor said. The roasted root vegetable dish. This one. Marin indicated a page. She doubled it in year 3. She was right to. Eleanor leaned in slightly to look. People went back for it twice. I can see why. It's a forgiving dish, and it travels well. People relax around food like that. Marin turned another page. I want to use her framework, what she built here. I don't want to come in and make it into something unrecognizable. Eleanor looked at her steadily. Why not? Because this supper belongs to Black Ridge, Marin said, and Black Ridge means Clara too. The silence that followed had a different quality than their usual kitchen silences. Eleanor picked up her tea, which was cold by now, and drank some of it anyway. Tell me what you're thinking, Eleanor said. So Marin told her. What Marin was thinking was this. Clara's supper had been good. Marin's supper was going to be better, not by discarding what Clara had done, but by taking it further, by adding the particular things that Marin knew and Clara hadn't had access to, by being precise about technique in ways that Clara's instinct hadn't required, because Clara had been gifted in ways that didn't need precision to land. She didn't say this to Eleanor, not in those terms. What she said was, her base is better than what I would have started from. I want to use it and add to it. The way a good song gets arranged by different people, the song is still the song. Eleanor looked at the notebook, looked at Marin. All right, she said. The town had opinions about the harvest supper at Black Ridge before it happened, because the town had opinions about everything at Black Ridge, and had since Marin arrived. The opinions traveled the way small-town opinions do, on the back of other conversations, inside remarks that were technically about something else. Margaret Holt, who owned the dry goods store with her husband Franklin, said to 3 separate women in the span of 1 week that she hoped the new Mrs. Voss hadn't been left in charge of too much, because you couldn't expect someone who'd come from, well, wherever she'd come from, to understand how a proper community supper worked. The Dennison brothers, who ran cattle 2 miles west of Black Ridge, wondered aloud over their fence line whether Callum Voss had made a good choice, all things considered. They didn't specify what things. They didn't need to. The hands was what they meant, the burned hands and the closed-off face and the lack of the right kind of conversation. Reverend Pruitt's wife, a woman named Dorothea, who meant well in the theoretical sense without always achieving it in practice, stopped Eleanor outside the general store the week before the supper and said, with her hand on Eleanor's arm, "You'll be managing things, of course. I know you'll see to it that it's done properly." Eleanor looked at Dorothea's hand on her arm. "Marin and I are managing it together," she said. Dorothea's smile stayed exactly where it was. "Of course," she said. "How lovely." Eleanor came home and told Marin, not because she needed to report it, but because the telling of it was its own response to the thing. Marin listened. She was rolling pastry at the time, and she didn't stop. "What did you say?" "I told her we were managing it together." "Good," Marin said. She looked like she'd bit into something unexpected. Eleanor sat down at the table. "People are going to come to this supper looking for something to have opinions about." "People always do," Marin said. "It doesn't bother you?" Marin thought about it honestly. The pastry went another pass under the rolling pin. "It bothers me," she said. "I just don't find it useful to show that it does." Eleanor considered this. Is that hard to manage? Some days more than others. The preparation for the supper took the better part of 2 weeks, and it was not a smooth or pretty process. The kitchen at Black Ridge was large by most standards, and inadequate by the standards of feeding 35 people a proper meal, and Marin worked around its limitations with the methodical creativity of someone who'd cooked in worse places with less to work with. She started what could be started early, the things that improved with time, the flavors that needed days to develop. The preserves that would anchor 2 of the dishes came off the cellar shelves and were assessed and incorporated. She made notes, crossed them out, rewrote them. Eleanor's bread schedule was restructured twice before they found a rhythm that would work on the day. Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway on the Wednesday before the supper and watched for a while. Marin had learned to let him watch. "What's that?" he asked, about something in the pot. "Stock," she said. "For Saturday. You've been running the stove for 3 days."
building layers, she said. You can't shortcut stock. It takes what it takes. He was quiet. Then, can I do something? She looked at him. He was looking at the pot. His jaw had the set of someone who'd had to work up to a question and was now pretending he hadn't. The onions need peeling, she said. About 2 dozen. He came in, found the onion basket, and sat at the work table. He was not fast at it, but he was careful. He didn't talk much, and she didn't fill the silence unnecessarily. About halfway through the onions, he said, without looking up, "My mother used to let me do this. Peel onions." "Did she?" "She said I was the only one who didn't complain about the eyes." "Do they bother you?" "Yes," he said. "I just didn't complain." Marin kept stirring. "She raised you right then." He didn't answer, and she didn't press, and the onions got peeled. Rook came to her 2 days before the supper with his arm, per her instructions. 3 weeks, and it had closed cleanly, no redness at the edges, exactly as it should have gone. She checked it in the kitchen, the same work table, while he sat and held the arm out with the slightly embarrassed air of a young man submitting to care he wasn't sure he deserved. "You kept it dry," she said. "Like you said." "The new skin's good." She pressed lightly at the edge of the scar. "Does that pull?" "A little. It'll ease. Another 2 months and you'll barely know it's there." She released his arm. "Keep using it normally. Don't favor it." He looked at his arm, then at her hands, then away, the way people did, but slower this time. Less the involuntary glance, more something deliberate. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask?" "Does it—" He stopped, started again. "Your hands. Do they do what you want them to? In the kitchen, all the things you do." She looked at her hands. She turned the left one over. "Mostly," she said. "The cold makes the left one stiff in the mornings. I work it loose. It's not— I've gotten used to working around it." "Doesn't that frustrate you?" "Sometimes," she said. "There are things I can't do as fast as I used to. Some cuts I have to approach differently." She looked at him. "But frustration doesn't change what they are." "So," he nodded. "Right," he said. He got up, flexed the healed arm experimentally. "For what it's worth," he said, looking at the door instead of at her, I think what you do is something. The cooking and all of it." She waited. "I just think so," he said, and left before it got more complicated than that. Saturday arrived with the kind of morning that couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Gray and overcast, a low sky that threatened snow without committing to it, cold enough that the breath of the horses hitched the wagons in the yard came out in visible clouds. People began arriving around 2 in the afternoon, when the light was already thinking about leaving. Marin had been up since 4. The kitchen, by the time the first wagon pulled into the yard, was running in every direction at once. Eleanor was at the breadboard. Marin was at the stove. Thomas, who had shown up without being asked at 5:30 that morning and hadn't left, was managing the second work table where the cold dishes were being assembled. Lucy was supposed to be upstairs, resting, because she still tired easily and the crowd would be a lot. She was, instead, sitting on the kitchen stool near the door, which was close enough to upstairs to qualify in her own calculation. "Lucy," Callum said, appearing in the kitchen doorway, "I thought you were—" "I'm not in the way," she said. He looked at Marin. "She's not in the way," Marin said. He rubbed the back of his neck. "All right." He looked around the kitchen, the controlled motion of it, the smells that had been building for days and were now arriving at something that even he, not a man who thought much about food as a thing to analyze, could feel reaching for something. "What do you need from me?" "Keep people out of this kitchen until 6, Marin said. "That's what I need." He almost smiled. The architecture of it was more complete this time than it had been by the fire. "I'll manage that," he said. The people who came to Blackridge's harvest supper that year came with the social armor that small communities carry to events where something might happen. The careful politeness that can turn to judgment on a quarter-second's notice. The Holts came. The Dennisons. Reverend Pruitt and Dorothea. 14 other families from the surrounding miles, their children bundled and their curiosity, however dressed up, essentially naked. They gathered in the main room and on the covered porch where Callum had set braziers for warmth, and they drank the cider Eleanor had put up in September, and they talked among themselves,
and more than a few of them found reasons to drift near the kitchen doorway before Callum quietly redirected them. Margaret Holt, to her credit, attempted it twice. At 6 o'clock, the tables, two long ones, pulled together and covered with what Eleanor had produced from the household linen in a minor act of determination, were set, and the food came out of the kitchen. Marin did not announce it. She and Eleanor and Thomas carried dishes to the table with the efficiency of people who had thought carefully about the sequence and were executing it, and the room noticed without being told to notice because the smell came first, before any of them could arrange their expressions. What hit the table that evening was this: a slow roasted beef that had been in the oven since before dawn, its surface dark and crackling, its interior the color of something earned rather than rushed. The root vegetable dish from Clara's notebook, made to the doubled quantity with the addition of a brown butter and herb finish that Clara's notes hadn't included, and Marin had added with the delicacy of someone who understood what she was building on. Two kinds of bread: Eleanor's everyday loaf, which was excellent, and a richer bread Marin had made with the last of the good lard and an egg wash that had given it a crust that shattered when you broke it. A preserved plum sauce that tasted like the end of summer in the middle of December. Roasted corn that shouldn't have been as good as it was from dried stores, and yet was, because of what Marin had done to it with heat and timing. Biscuits in a basket, because Marin made good biscuits. A bean dish that was not fancy and was not trying to be, built on the smoked pork from the Hendersons and seasoned with the particular patience that made beans taste like something instead of nothing. The room went quiet, not immediately. There was still the business of sitting down, of passing dishes, of the ordinary noise of 35 people at a table. But within the first few minutes of the meal beginning, the quality of the noise changed. The conversation that had been running at the performed volume of social occasions dropped to something more real. People were eating. Actually eating. Not the polite 2 bites while talking eating of obligation, but the focused, genuine eating of people who had been given something worth their attention. Dorothea Pruitt took a bite of the roasted beef and looked at her husband. He was already looking at her. They didn't say anything. Franklin Holt had the bean dish, and then had more of it, and then looked slightly surprised at himself for having more of it. The Dennison brothers, who were by nature not effusive men, ate with the kind of quiet that in their particular case was a form of high praise. Margaret Holt, 2 seats down from Eleanor, said, and she said it in a low voice, but Eleanor heard it, "This is Clara's supper." Eleanor looked at her. "I mean, it's better than Clara's," Margaret said, with the slight difficulty of a woman revising a statement mid-sentence. "But it feels like hers. It feels like it belongs here." Eleanor considered this for a moment. "It does," she said. "That's the point." And then the thing that stopped the table happened. It didn't happen loudly. It happened the way real things often do, quietly, in the middle of everything else, requiring a moment to be noticed before it could be understood. Lucy was seated beside Thomas, which was where she always sat when she came to the table. She had been served a plate, a real plate, not a child's portion, and she had eaten the bread first because she always ate the bread first, and then the root vegetables. And then she'd worked at the beef with the methodical approach of someone who was eating rather than performing eating, which was itself something that anyone who'd seen her 6 weeks ago would have noticed. She finished her plate. She sat with her fork and looked at the table. Then she looked at Marin, who was 2 seats away, and said, in the carrying voice of a child who has not yet learned to modulate for audience, "Can I have more?" The table heard it. Not all of it, not the whole length of the room, but the people nearby heard it, and a few of them looked. And among those people were several who had been in this community long enough to know what those 3 words from Lucy Voss meant. The Dennison boy, who was 17 and had been at a supper here 2 winters ago when Lucy had eaten nothing and sat beside her mother with a face like something with all the light gone out of it. Old Hank's wife, visiting from where she lived outside Hargrove, who had heard her husband talk about the girl and recognized her, and now looked at the empty plate with an expression she had to look away from. Thomas reached for the serving dish without saying anything and put more on Lucy's plate. Lucy picked up her fork and kept eating. The table resumed its noise and the evening moved on. The way evenings do, but the quality of it had shifted in a way that was not spoken about directly and was therefore more permanent than if it had been. The room had witnessed something, not a spectacle. There had been no announcement, no performance, no moment engineered for effect. A child had finished her plate and asked for more,
And everyone who understood what that meant carried it home with them at the end of the night, like something given to them without being asked if they wanted it. Marin was in the kitchen when it happened. She heard it from there, the particular clarity of Lucy's voice carrying through the doorway, and she set down the cloth she was holding and stood very still for a moment. She did not cry. She thought she might, and then she didn't, and she wasn't sure whether to be relieved or disappointed about that. She picked up the cloth again and went back to work. Eleanor came into this kitchen 10 minutes later and stood beside her at the work table and said nothing for a moment. Then she asked for seconds. "I know," Marin said. Eleanor looked at the wall. "Half this room didn't expect you to be able to boil water without doing something wrong," she said. "Some of them are reconsidering some things tonight." "Good," Marin said. "It's more than the food." "I know. They're watching you," Eleanor said. "Margaret Holt especially. She keeps looking at the kitchen doorway." Marin dried her hands on the cloth. "What's she looking for?" "I think she's deciding something," Eleanor said. "I think most of them are." Marin looked at her. "And you?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. The sounds of the supper came through the doorway. Voices, the scrape of a chair, someone's laugh that was genuine rather than polite. "I decided a while ago," Eleanor said. She picked up a serving dish that needed to go back to the table and carried it out without elaborating. Callum found Marin in the kitchen near the end of the evening, when most of the guests were in the final stages of the kind of satisfied, slow conversation that comes after a good meal. He came in under the pretense of refilling the cider pitcher and then stood by the work table and looked at her. "They're not going to stop talking about this for a month," he said. "The food or Lucy?" "Both." He set the pitcher down. "Marin, don't," she said. Not harshly, just honestly. He looked at her. "Don't thank me right now," she said. "It'll make me feel like I did it for that." And I didn't. He was quiet. "Why did you do it?" She thought about it seriously because he was asking seriously. "Because Lucy asked me what was in the dumplings," she said. "Because your household ledger had Claire's handwriting in it, and it was good handwriting. Because Eleanor knows bread in a way I don't, and she shouldn't be standing aside for anyone." She paused. "Because this family deserved one evening where everything worked." Callum looked at the kitchen. His kitchen, or Claire's kitchen, or Marin's kitchen, or all of those things at once. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he'd stopped seeing and is seeing again. "The town is going to have to revise its opinion of you," he said. "The town can take its time," she said. "I'm not in a hurry." He looked at her hands, where they rested on the work table. He'd done this before, yes, the involuntary glance, the recovery. But this time was different. This time he didn't look away quickly. He looked at her hands and then he looked at her face, and she let him look. "I should have asked," he said, "a long time before now. What happened?" "You're asking now," she said. "You don't have to—" "I know I don't." She turned her left hand over the way she'd done for Rook, the same simple gesture. "It was a fire," she said, "in a kitchen, which is a particular kind of irony, a boarding house, in a town about 3 days east of here by wagon. The stove caught wrong and the curtain went up and the curtain was close to everything else." She paused. "There was a child in the room." Callum was very still. "She was 2, Marin said, "the daughter of one of the women boarding there. She was in the corner, near where the fire was going." She looked at her hands. "I don't remember deciding to go in. I remember the heat, and I remember the child, and I remember coming out." She turned her hand back over. "The child was fine. I was less fine for a while." The kitchen was quiet. "You never told anyone, Chang," he said. It wasn't accusatory, so it was almost wondering. "It didn't seem like information that required an audience," she said. People assumed whatever they wanted to," she said. "That's what people do. I can't control that." Callum looked at the doorway through which his daughter's laughter had come earlier in the evening, a sound that had stopped the hearts of everyone who knew what it had cost her to make it. He looked at the woman standing in his kitchen, with her careful hands and her economy of words, and the particular way she had of moving through a space as though she had considered, before entering it, exactly how much room she was allowed to take. He said something then that he would remember saying for a long time, not because it was eloquent, it wasn't, but because it was true in the way that only simple things manage to be. "I'm glad you came here," he said. She met his eyes.
She held his gaze for a moment longer than she usually allowed herself. "So am I," she said. And then she picked up the cloth again, because there was still work to be done, and she went back to it. Outside, the overcast sky had finally made up its mind. The first real snow of December was coming down, quiet and deliberate, covering the yard and the fence line and the roof of Black Ridge Ranch in something clean. The last wagons would have cold work getting home. The horses would need extra feed tomorrow. The fence in the north pasture that had been giving trouble would need checking in the morning. There was always something. There was always the next thing. But for the length of that night, with the snow coming down and the house full of the particular warmth that good food and witnessed grace can make, Black Ridge held itself together around something it hadn't been certain it still had. The sense that it was, despite everything, a place where life could still be made. The snow that had started the night of the harvest supper didn't stop for 2 days. By Sunday morning, the yard was under 8 inches, and the fence line to the north had disappeared entirely into a white that made the world look smaller than it was, compressed to whatever you could see from the nearest window. The horses stayed in the barn. The cattle had been moved to the lower pasture before the storm hit, which was the one piece of good foresight the week had offered. The ranch hands took turns on the cold work, and the kitchen ran hot from before dawn, and Black Ridge hunkered into the snow the way it had every winter for 20-odd years, with its jaw set and its provisions counted and no particular illusion that the weather was going to negotiate. What the storm also did, incidentally, was keep people indoors with their thoughts, and some of those thoughts were about Saturday night. Callum knew this because Hargrove was a small enough town that thoughts didn't stay private long, and by Monday, when the roads were passable again, and Pete Calloway made his regular mail run, 3 separate pieces of news arrived at Black Ridge along with a letter from a seed supplier and a past due notice on a piece of equipment Callum had half forgotten. The first piece of news was from Hank, relayed from his wife, who had spoken to 2 women from town on her way home Saturday and had heard from both of them that the supper had been the best anyone could remember. The second was from Miguel, who had a cousin in Hargrove and had heard that Franklin Holt had told someone at the feed store that Callum Voss's new wife could cook in a way that made you rethink your previous understanding of the word. The third piece of news came from Dooley, who had simply heard, without attribution, that people were talking. Callum received all of this with the expression of a man who wasn't sure whether to be pleased or braced for something. He told Marin over coffee Monday morning. She listened, poured herself another cup, and said, "People will say what they say. They're saying good things. For now," she said. "Good things have shorter memories than bad ones. Let it settle." He looked at her. He'd been looking at her differently since Saturday night, since the kitchen, since the conversation about the fire, with a particular quality of attention that was different from the polite distance he'd been maintaining. It wasn't entirely comfortable being looked at that way. But she hadn't told him to stop. "I want to tell them," he said, "the story of your hands. What actually happened?" She set her cup down. "Why?" "Because they have the wrong idea. They have an unknown," she said. "People fill unknowns with whatever suits them. That's not new." "It's not right either." "No," she agreed. "It's not right. But me defending myself isn't going to land the same way as... It's different when it comes from me." Callum looked at the table. He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn. "I know," he said. "That's why I want to be the one to say it." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, Cleet and Rook were clearing the path between the bunkhouse and the barn, their voices carrying in the cold. Some argument about the correct way to use a snow shovel that would have no resolution and no consequence. The ordinary noise of the place. "There'll be a gathering at the general store," she said. "Before Christmas. There's always one." "3rd week of December," he said. "Usually." "That's when," she said. "If you're going to say it then, in front of the people who've been deciding what to think." He looked at her. "You're sure?" "No," she said honestly. "But I don't see a better option, and I'm tired of being a question mark that people answer wrong." He nodded, slowly. "All right," he said. 3rd week of December. She picked up her coffee and went back to the morning. The 2 weeks between the supper and the general store gathering were not quiet weeks, but they were different in quality from what had come before. Something had shifted in the house's internal atmosphere, not transformed, not resolved, but shifted, the way a room changes when someone opens a window that's been painted shut for years. The air moved differently, Thomas was the most visible example of this. He came to breakfast without being called, which he hadn't reliably done since October. He did his work without the particular resentful efficiency he'd been using since Marin arrived. Still efficient, still largely silent, but the resentment had a different flavor now, less directed. He appeared in the kitchen doorway 2 more times in those weeks, on both occasions with a practical question that was functionally an excuse to be nearby, and Marin accepted both excuses at face value and answered both questions directly. On the second occasion, standing at the work table with a harness buckle that needed resoldering that was technically not a kitchen problem at all, he said, without particular preamble, "My mother would have liked you." Marin kept her hands on what she was doing. "What makes you say that?" He turned the buckle in his hands. She liked people who did things without making a big deal about it, who just handled things. He paused. She had no patience for people who needed credit for everything they did. That's a good quality in a person. Yeah. He set the buckle down. She was hard to be around sometimes. She had high expectations. "So I've gathered," Marin said. He looked at her. "From what?" "From her kitchen," Marin said. "From her notebook, from her children." She glanced at him once. Just once. High expectations are a kind of love. They take more energy than low ones. Thomas stood there with that for a moment. Then he picked up the buckle and left, and Marin heard him in the hallway for a few seconds before the back door opened and the cold came in briefly, and then the door closed behind him. Lucy, for her part, had decided that Marin was a resource. This was the most honest way to describe the relationship that had developed between them, though relationship was perhaps too formal a word for what was more like a gravitational situation. Lucy had identified, with the unsentimental accuracy of a child who has spent time in genuine difficulty, that Marin was useful and consistent and didn't pretend things were easier than they were. These were qualities Lucy valued, having lived in a house full of people trying very hard to make things seem manageable. She appeared in the kitchen at unpredictable intervals, with questions that ranged from the practical to the unanswerable. Some days it was about food. What was Marin making? What did something taste like? Could she try some? Other days it was something else. "Did it hurt?" she asked one afternoon, sitting on the kitchen stool while Marin worked. "When your hands were burned?" "Yes," Marin said. "Very much." "Were you scared?" Marin thought about it. "Afterward I was. While it was happening, I was mostly busy." Lucy seemed to find this interesting. Busy doing what? Getting out, getting the child out. She added something to the pot. When something is happening, you're usually too occupied to be scared. It's when it's over that fear shows up. Is that true for other things too? "For me it is," Marin said. "When your mother died, were you scared right away, or did it come later?" It was a direct question, maybe too direct, and she'd taken a risk asking it. Lucy was quiet for long enough that Marin thought she'd miscalculated. "Later," Lucy said. "At first there wasn't room for it, and then there was too much room, and I didn't know what to do with it." "Yes," Marin said. "That's exactly what it's like." Lucy sat with that. "Is it always going to feel like too much room?" "No," Marin said. "It starts to fill in, slowly, with other things." She looked at the girl. "Not replacement things, just the room gets used for living in again." Lucy looked at the kitchen, at the pot on the stove and the bread on the shelf and the small tins lined up near the window, at the space that had, over the course of months, become a working place again instead of a place where absence sat. "Okay," she said. Just that, the way she sometimes did when she'd finished processing something. "What's for supper?" "Pork and potato," Marin said. "With the onions?" "Yes." "Good," Lucy said, and got off the stool and went upstairs, and Marin stood at the stove and let out a breath she hadn't been entirely aware she was holding. Eleanor knew about the plan for the general store gathering. Callum had told her, and she had sat with it for a day before she came to Marin with her thoughts. She came in the evening when the house was quiet and sat at the kitchen table with the directness of a woman who had decided what she was going to say and was going to say it. "I want to be there when he tells them," she said. Marin looked at her. "All right." "I have things to add," Eleanor said. "Things I've seen since you came here that the town doesn't know about. Not just the supper. The boy with the arm, and the way you've managed this household, and—" She stopped, started again.
and what you've done for Lucy. Eleanor, Marin said carefully, you don't owe me.
I'm not paying a debt, Eleanor said, with some sharpness. I know the difference. I want people to know what I've seen, because I was one of the ones who wasn't sure about you, and I was wrong, and I'd like to be the one to say it. Marin was quiet for a moment. That's not nothing, she said. That's harder than it sounds. I know it is, Eleanor said without self-congratulation. I'm not under any illusions about that. They looked at each other across the kitchen table, the two of them, and what passed between them was the particular understanding of women who have been at odds with each other and come out the other side still standing and perhaps the better for it. All right, Marin said, we'll all go. The gathering at Hargrove's General Store the third week of December was the usual thing, the kind of event that served the practical purpose of community contact and the less acknowledged purpose of gossip exchange, people picking up supplies and mail and conversation in roughly equal measure. The store was warm and too crowded and smelled of coffee and damp wool, and Franklin Holt had put out a tray of something baked that had been there long enough to be making an effort without quite succeeding. They arrived together, Callum, Marin, Eleanor. Thomas had come too, which had been his own decision, stated at breakfast with a matter-of-factness that didn't invite discussion. Lucy had stayed home with Hank's wife, who had come to visit and was glad to sit by the fire with a child who was, for the first time in a long time, genuinely good company. The store noticed them come in. It noticed in the way that rooms notice things when they've been talking about someone and that someone walks through the door. The quality of the sound changed for just a moment, and then resumed, and the resumption was louder than it needed to be. Margaret Holt came over within 2 minutes, which was faster than genuine coincidence and slower than the immediate impulse had probably suggested. Mr. Voss, she said, your harvest supper was remarkable. Everyone's been saying. Marin and Eleanor managed it, Callum said. Margaret looked at Marin. There was something complicated in the look. The recalibration of someone who is committed to an opinion and is finding the terrain underneath it shifting. The food was extraordinary, she said. I don't think I've eaten better. Thank you, Marin said. She said it simply, without elaborate modesty or performance. Reverend Pruitt was there. The Dennisons. Several of the families from the supper and several who hadn't attended. It was a full room. Callum waited until the initial social movements had settled, until people had their coffee and had completed the first round of transactions and were in the slower, more conversational phase of the gathering. Then he spoke. He didn't stand on anything or call for attention. He simply raised his voice enough to carry, the way a man raises his voice when he knows the room will quiet for him because he doesn't do it often. I want to say something, he said, about my wife. The room stilled. There's been talk, he said, since Marin arrived. I know there has. About her hands. About what happened to them. People have had their ideas. He looked around the room without accusation, just steadily. The truth is, she didn't tell me right away, and I didn't push because I'd already seen enough to know the kind of person she was before I knew the story. But I know it now, and I want you to know it too. The room was very quiet. 3 years ago, he said, in a boarding house 2 days' ride east, a kitchen fire broke out. There was a child in the room, a 2-year-old girl. He paused. Marin went in for her. She got the child out. Her hands are the way they are because she didn't stop to think about the cost of going in. He said it plainly, without embellishment, which was the right way to say it. Embellishment would have let people focus on the telling instead of the fact. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of people adjusting, the internal sound of prior assumptions meeting new information and having to decide which one gave way. Margaret Holt looked at Marin's hands, then at her face. The expression on Margaret's face was not comfortable, but it was honest, which was better. Eleanor stepped forward then because she'd said she would, and she had said it and she would keep it. I want to add to that, she said, and the room stayed quiet because Eleanor Briggs was a woman the town respected and knew, and when she spoke on a serious matter, people listened. I came to Black Ridge to protect that family after Clara died. That was my job, and I took it seriously. When Marin arrived, I was not welcoming. She didn't flinch at saying it. What I've seen in the months since is a woman who has given this household everything she had without once asking for anything in return. She brought Lucy back to the table. She kept the ranch running through the hardest part of the season. She did it without complaint and without... She paused, and something in her voice was careful. Without ever once trying to take Clara's place. She made room for Clara to still be there. Eleanor stopped. I wanted to say that. In front of people. The room took a moment. Dorothea Pruitt in the back pressed her hand to her mouth. Not dramatically. Just the small private gesture of someone feeling something they didn't expect. One of the Dennison brothers, the older one, Garrett, who maybe spoke twice a year if the occasion genuinely required it, looked at Marin and said, "That was a brave thing, going in for the child." "It was a fast thing," Marin said. "I'm not sure they're the same." "I think they are," he said, and went back to his coffee. Margaret Holt set down her cup and crossed the room to Marin. She stood in front of her, and she looked, really looked, at her, and then at her hands. "I've said unkind things," Margaret said. Her voice was low. "Not to your face, but in ways that reached you. I know that." "You said what you saw," Marin said. "You didn't have the full picture." "I didn't try to get it," Margaret said. "There's a difference." She straightened. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Voss." Mrs. Voss. It was the first time anyone in that town had called her that without irony or distance in the syllables. Marin looked at her. "Thank you," she said. It wasn't forgiveness exactly. Forgiveness was a longer project than a moment in a general store, but it was a door opened, and a door opened was enough to work with. Callum, beside her, didn't say anything. He was close enough that his arm was near hers, and he didn't step away, and she didn't either. The gathering continued. People moved around, refilled their coffee, completed their purchases. The ordinary texture of a community event reasserted itself. But the texture was different than it had been an hour ago. And everyone in the room knew it, and some of them would spend the drive home being honest with themselves about what they'd been carrying toward this woman since October. And most of those honest reckonings would be uncomfortable, and some of them would lead somewhere better than where they'd started. On the ride back to Black Ridge, the four of them in the wagon with blankets over their laps and the horse steady on the packed snow of the road, Thomas said from the back where he and Marin were sitting, "That was something." "Yes," Marin said. "Garrett Dennison," he said. "He doesn't say anything to anyone." "I noticed." "He meant it," Thomas said. "When he says something, he means it." "I know," she said. "That's why it mattered." Thomas looked at the road behind them. Then he looked at his hands, his own young, unhurt hands, and then at Marin's. He didn't say anything else, but the silence he kept the rest of the ride home was not the old silence, not the wall of 15-year-old grief and suspicion. It was something more like companionship, in the quiet, specific way that some people offer it, by being present without requiring anything from the presence. Eleanor, in the front seat beside Callum, said nothing at all, but she sat with a straightness that had a different quality than her usual straightness. Like something she'd been carrying in her spine had been set down. The ranch came into view as they crested the last hill before the property. The house, the barn, the outbuildings, all of it white-roofed and smoke trailing against the late afternoon sky. The lamp was already on in the kitchen window, which meant Hank's wife had gotten the fire going for them, which meant there'd be warmth when they walked in. Marin looked at it. The house at the end of the day, with its imperfect roof and its patched porch, and its single-lit window against the dark. She looked at it the way she had not permitted herself to look at it in all the weeks since she'd arrived. Not as a place she was managing or surviving or proving herself in, but as a place that was, in some accumulating and undeniable way, becoming hers. Not because she had claimed it, because she had earned it, and the only currency that was worth anything. Showing up every day and doing what needed doing and letting the rest arrange itself in its own time. The wagon pulled into the yard and the horse stopped, and the four of them climbed down into the cold, and the kitchen light held steady in the window, waiting. The kitchen light had been waiting for them, and they walked into it. Hank's wife, a small, deliberate woman named Ruth, who had the habit of making herself useful in other people's houses without being asked and without overstaying, had the stove going and a pot of something simple on it, and Lucy was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of warm milk and a book she was pretending to read while actually watching the door. When it opened and the cold came in with the four of them, Lucy looked up, and the expression on her face was the unguarded kind that children produce before they remember to manage themselves. You were gone a long time, she said. Roads were slow, Callum said. Ruth made soup. I can smell it, he said, and the ordinary exchange of it, the simple back and forth of a father and daughter noting the facts of an evening, was so normal, so unremarkable, that it was remarkable. 6 months ago, Lucy had barely spoken at the table. Now she was keeping track of how long they'd been gone. Ruth put on her coat, accepted Callum's thanks with the brevity of someone who doesn't need them and knows it, and left for home. The house settled into itself. The sounds of boots coming off and coats being hung and the stove ticking with heat. Eleanor disappeared upstairs with the particular quiet of a woman who needed the day to be finished, and Thomas went to the bunkhouse briefly to tell Dooley something about the morning's work, and then came back in, which was the kind of thing he'd started doing lately, going and coming back, instead of just going. Marin stood at the stove and looked at Ruth's soup. She tasted it once and made a small adjustment from one of the tins on the shelf. The time tin, the one that had started as hers and had gradually become simply part of the kitchen's inventory. And then she set the table for 4. I already ate, Lucy said. I know, Marin said. I set 4 places anyway. Lucy looked at the 4 places. Oh, she said, understanding something that she didn't need explained, and she picked up her book again. After supper, after Lucy had been persuaded that bed was not a punishment but a biological requirement, and after Thomas had sat for a while at the kitchen table and then taken himself off to his room with a comprehensiveness that suggested he'd needed the day to end too, Callum and Marin were alone in the kitchen for the first time since the night of the supper. He poured 2 cups of coffee that neither of them particularly needed and set one in front of her. How are you? He asked. He asked it like he actually wanted to know, which had not always been the case with that question in her experience. Tired, she said, and fine. The store today? It went the way it needed to. Margaret Holt pulled me aside before we left, he said, while you were talking to Eleanor. Marin waited. She apologized to me, he said, for the things she'd said. About you. He paused. I told her she needed to direct that to you, not me. She did, Marin said. In the store. It was fine. Was it? She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. The left one was stiff. The cold of the ride home had gotten into it, and the warmth of the cup was deliberate, not accidental. It was a start, she said. Starts are enough. He looked at her. The lamp between them made the kitchen smaller than it was, or maybe it was just the hour and the quiet, and the fact of the day they'd had. What made you decide, he said, to come here? When you answered the letter, what made you say yes? She considered the question seriously, because he was asking it seriously. I'd been useful in other people's places for a long time, she said. I was ready for a place to be useful, and that had some chance of being mine. She looked at the table. The letter you wrote, it wasn't... She stopped. Started again. Most of the letters were asking for something, wanting a certain kind of woman, describing what they needed. Yours read like you were telling the truth about a hard situation and seeing if anyone could stand to hear it. I was, he said. I know, she said. That's why I answered. He was quiet. He turned his coffee cup. Outside, the wind had picked up slightly. Nothing serious, just winter doing its usual accounting. The fire in the other room had been banked for the night and was settling into its lower, steadier heat. I want you to move out of the attic, he said. She looked at him. He cleared his throat. There's a room on the 2nd floor, the corner room. It has 2 windows and the view's decent, and it's warm, actually warm, not just less cold than the attic. He was not looking directly at her. I should have offered it when you arrived. That was wrong of me. You didn't know me when I arrived, she said. I knew enough, he said. I knew you were here, and the attic was not a room I'd have given anyone I was treating with basic decency. She didn't argue with that because it was true. All right, she said. He looked up. All right, you'll move? Or all right, you've heard me? All right, I'll move, she said. Tomorrow. He nodded. There was something more in his expression, something that wasn't quite finished, something working toward words it hadn't found yet. She waited, because she'd learned that Callum Voss thought before he spoke, and the thinking took the time it took. I want this to be a real thing, he said finally. What we are. I'm not... I know I haven't been. He stopped. I know this arrangement has been more arrangement than anything else, and that's been my fault more than yours. It's been both of us being careful, she said. Maybe, he said, but I was using careful to keep a distance I didn't have to keep. He looked at her. You're a good person, Maren. I think you've been a good person for a long time in situations that didn't make it easy. And I think this family would be. I think we already are better for having you in it. And I'd like you to know that I see that. Not just what you do, what you are. The kitchen held still around that. She had not, in a very long time, been told what she was rather than what she did. The two felt different in the body. The doing was always safer. Doing could be evaluated, measured, found adequate or wanting. What you are was less negotiable. It sat differently in the chest. I see you too, she said. If it matters. It matters, he said. They sat with their coffee for a while after that, and the conversation moved to smaller things. The north fence, the cattle, what needed doing before the real deep of winter set in. And the smaller things were exactly right for the hour. Real life doesn't sustain the altitude of significant moments for long. It comes back down to what needs doing, to the practical and the ordinary is where you actually live. Maren had learned this a long time ago. It was, she thought, one of the more useful things she knew. The corner room was indeed warm. It had a south-facing window and a west-facing window, and on a clear day the light in the morning came in at an angle that covered the floor in a rectangle of pale gold that moved slowly toward the door as the hours passed. There was a proper bed, wider than the attic's narrow plank, and a dresser with a mirror above it that was slightly foxed at one corner, and a chair by the south window where, it became apparent within the first week, a person could sit and see most of the yard and the near pasture, and on very clear days, the dark line of the ridge to the north. Maren moved her things from the attic in one trip because she still didn't have much. The tins went on the dresser, the book went on the windowsill, the small tin with the buttons and the ribbon and the worn note. She opened it, the morning of the move, and looked at what was in it for longer than she usually permitted herself. Then she closed it and put it on the dresser beside the others, where it would be visible and not hidden, which was a small thing and a deliberate one. Eleanor knocked on the open door that first morning and looked around the room. Better light, she said. Yes, Maren agreed. Eleanor looked at the tins on the dresser, at the book on the windowsill, at the room taking on the texture of being someone's room. Good, she said, with the brisk finality of a woman who has made a decision she's satisfied with, and went back to the bread she had rising. December moved. The way December moves in that country, cold and purposeful, each day a little shorter than the one before, the dark coming earlier and staying later. The work of the ranch didn't stop for winter, but it changed in character. More maintenance, more management, more of the internal work of keeping things in order until the season turned. The hands were occupied. The animals were tended. The kitchen at Black Ridge produced 3 meals a day that were, by any honest measure, better than what the house had eaten in years. But the most significant thing that December produced was quieter than any of that. It happened by accumulation rather than event. Lucy came downstairs one morning and came directly to the kitchen and stood beside Maren at the stove while Maren was making breakfast. Just stood there the way children stand beside adults when they want to be near without being a subject, and Maren let her stand there without comment. After a while, Lucy said, "Can I stir that?" And Maren handed her the spoon. Lucy stirred carefully and with the excessive concentration of a child who has decided to take a task seriously, and Maren watched from the side and corrected the direction once and left the rest alone. "You keep the spoon moving," Maren said. "Otherwise it catches on the bottom." "Why does it catch?" "Because the bottom is hotter than the top and the bottom wants to cook faster than the rest of it. You're convincing it to be patient." Lucy stirred with renewed purpose. "Cooking is a lot of convincing things," she said. "Most things worth doing are," Maren said. Thomas, who was passing through to the back door and had heard this exchange, paused in the doorway. He looked at his sister at the stove and said nothing, but the look on his face was the kind that takes years to produce. Something that was grief and relief, and something that might have been gratitude, all existing in the same space without resolving into any one of them. He caught Maren's eye. He gave her a nod, just one, small, unambiguous, and went out. She'd learned enough about Thomas Voss by December to understand that a nod from him was not a small currency. Christmas came on a Thursday that year, which meant the week around it had a particular shape, the end of the year pressing in from one side and the weather from the other, and the house managing both by the simple act of staying occupied. Eleanor made a fruitcake that was better than anything Marin had encountered in that category, dense and dark, and requiring a narrow slice because a wide one would defeat you. Marin made a pie from the preserved plums and the last of the good lard, and the crust was the kind that reminded you, if you'd forgotten, why people bothered with crust at all. Lucy hung things from the porch beam, paper shapes she'd cut with the focused determination of a child who has a project and is not to be interrupted during it. Thomas pretended not to be interested in this and was, transparently, interested. He helped her hang the ones she couldn't reach, and he did it without comment, and Lucy accepted the help without ceremony, and the exchange between them was exactly right for what they were. A brother and sister who had carried something heavy together for too long, and were, slowly and imperfectly, and with the occasional eruption of 15-year-old impatience or 8-year-old stubbornness, beginning to set it down. Callum watched his children from across the yard one afternoon, where he was working the fence he was always working. He watched Thomas hold Lucy up so she could reach the last hook on the beam, and Lucy's paper shape went on the hook, and she said something that made Thomas roll his eyes, and then he put her down and she ran inside to get another one. Callum stood at the fence and breathed the cold air and felt the season around him with a fullness that he hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness, exactly, because happiness was too thin a word for something this mixed with memory and time. More like a reclaiming. More like returning to a country he'd been absent from without planning to leave. He went back to the fence. There was still work to do. There was always work to do. But the work felt different when you were doing it for something that was intact. New Year's came and went the way it does on a working ranch, noted, not celebrated with any great fuss. The calendar turning over less because anyone had time for ceremony, and more because time passed regardless of whether you were paying attention to it. January arrived in the way of a guest who had no interest in whether you were ready. But January at Black Ridge was a different thing than January the year before. And the year before that. Marin knew this not from any single moment, but from the aggregate of mornings. The kitchen was warm by the time anyone else came downstairs. The coffee was ready. There was food that had been thought about, not just assembled, but considered, made with the attention of someone who understood that meals were the structure around which days were built. And that structure mattered more in winter than any other season, because in winter the structure was sometimes the only thing holding the shape of a day together. Eleanor appeared each morning and they worked, the two of them, in the rhythms they'd built over months. Rhythms that had no drama in them now, just the practical music of two people who knew each other's patterns and had stopped fighting them. Eleanor's bread came out of the oven at 9. Marin's noon meal was on the table at 12. They didn't thank each other for these things because the thanks had been absorbed into the ordinary, which was where all real appreciation eventually lives. One morning in late January, Eleanor came downstairs and found Marin at the kitchen table with Claire's notebook open in front of her and a new piece of paper beside it, where she was writing something in her own hand. Eleanor stopped. "I'm adding to it," Marin said. "Things I've learned here. Things that work in this kitchen, with these stores, in this climate." She looked up. "I thought we should keep it together. Her notes and whatever this is." Eleanor looked at the 2 pages side by side. Claire's careful small hand, Marin's slightly looser one, trained, precise, but with a different energy behind it, like someone who wrote the way they cooked, efficiently, with occasional moments of something that went beyond efficiency. "She'd have wanted it added to," Eleanor said, after a moment. "I thought so too," Marin said. Eleanor sat down. She looked at both pages for a while. Then she said, "Write down the dumpling recipe, the one with the time. Write it down the way you make it." "It's not the kind of thing that translates well to—" "Write it down anyway," Eleanor said, "as close as you can get it, for Lucy." She paused. "For when she's older and wants to know." Marin looked at her. Recipes are a form of memory," Eleanor said, a little gruffly, as though she'd said something more personal than she'd intended and was not entirely comfortable with it. "We should keep the good ones." Marin picked up her pen and wrote the dumpling recipe into Claire's notebook, below the last of Claire's entries, in the space that had been waiting since the season Clara Voss stopped filling it, There is something that gets lost in the way people tell stories about places being transformed and families being healed. The telling tends toward the dramatic, the single moment, the turning point, the revelation that changes everything. Life at Black Ridge didn't work that way, and it would be dishonest to suggest it did. What actually happened was smaller and more durable than drama. It happened in the accumulated weight of ordinary days, in a ranch hand's healed arm, and the way he stood differently after, like someone who had learned that being cared for wasn't the same as being diminished. In the fence line that got properly fixed in February because Thomas had said where the bad section was, and Marin had told Callum, and Callum had gone to look. And the three of them had arrived at the solution through a chain of small trusts that wouldn't have existed in October. In Hank eating third servings on cold days and having a face that said he'd earned them. In Cleet, who had made the most wrong assumptions about the most things, becoming gradually and without ceremony the ranch hand who checked whether Marin needed anything from town when he made a run, and who asked the question in a way that made it clear the offer was genuine. It happened in Lucy, who by February was not only eating full meals but had developed opinions about food that she expressed with 8-year-old directness, and that Marin took seriously because opinions about food are opinions about the world, and taking them seriously was a way of saying your experience of things matters, and I want to know about it. In Thomas, who stopped performing his distance around Marin and started performing something more like normalcy, which for him looked like grudging participation and occasional genuine laughter that he tried to walk back and couldn't quite. And it happened in Callum and Marin, in the particular territory of two people who came to each other from different directions and are finding, with some difficulty, and without the luxury of pretending it's easy, that they can occupy the same life. They were not a love story of the simple kind. They were something more honest than that. Two people who had chosen each other without knowing each other, who had learned each other under duress, who had found, in the finding, something that was not what either of them had expected and was better for that. He made her coffee in the morning sometimes, which was a small thing and felt like something larger. She sat with him by the fire sometimes in the evenings, with her book or without it, and the sitting was its own language. He told her things about the ranch, about his plans for it, about the specific grief and specific pride that a man has about the land he's working. And she listened with the full attention of someone genuinely interested because she was. She told him things too, more slowly, in the way of someone who had spent a long time keeping things to herself and was recalibrating. The things she told him were not always easy to hear, and he did not always know what to say in response, and she did not require him to. She required only that he stayed in the room. He stayed in the room. February brought a thaw, brief and false, the kind that convinces you spring is thinking about arriving and then rescinds the offer. But the days it brought were real enough while they lasted. The drip of snow from the barn roof, the particular quality of light, when it's reflecting off white rather than just sitting above it, the way the horses moved differently in the yard when the ground had some give in it again. On one of those false spring afternoons, Marin was on the porch with a mending project that was going poorly because mending was not something she'd ever done well, and she'd stopped pretending otherwise. Lucy came out and sat beside her on the porch step and looked at what she was doing. "That's crooked," Lucy said. "I know. Aunt Eleanor does it better. I know that too." Lucy pulled her coat tighter. The air was cold but bearable, and the yard was wet, and the sound of the water running off the roof was pleasant in the way of things that promise other things. "Marin," Lucy said. "Yes." "Are you going to stay?" Marin looked at her. Lucy was looking at the yard, not at her, which meant the question was serious, and she was managing herself while she asked it. "Yes," Marin said. "Even when it's hard?" "Even then." "How do you know?" Marin set down the mending. She looked at the yard, at the fence, and the barn, and the pasture that she'd arrived at in October not knowing, and had been learning every day since. At the house behind her with its imperfect roof and its kitchen light and its noise of ordinary life. At the family that had been broken and was being, slowly and with effort and without perfection, rebuilt. "Because this is mine," she said, not in the way of owning something, in the way of belonging somewhere. She paused. "I haven't belonged somewhere in a long time. I'm not inclined to give it up." Lucy thought about this. "I'm glad you came," she said, in the matter-of-fact way she had, not performing the emotion, just stating it, the way children state things that are simply true. Me too, Marin said. Lucy leaned slightly against her arm. Not dramatically, just a drift of weight, the way a child moves toward warmth. Marin didn't make anything of it. She picked up the mending again and kept working at the crooked seam, which remained crooked, and the afternoon held them both in the particular tenderness of early false spring. And the water kept dripping from the barn roof, and somewhere in the north pasture the cattle were moving with the unhurried confidence of animals who understood that the season was turning. Callum came out of the barn and saw them on the porch, and he stopped for a moment, watching, with the expression of a man looking at something he had been afraid to want and is learning, with difficulty and gratitude in equal measure, that wanting it is allowed. He didn't call out or interrupt. He just looked for a moment, and then he went back to his work. What the frontier remembered about that season, in the way that places remember things, through the people who carry it forward in their telling, was not a scandal or a spectacle. There had been no spectacle. There had only been a woman who arrived in the cold with burned hands and a single trunk, who had stood in a kitchen that didn't want her and begun, without announcement, to make it work, who had fed a child who wasn't eating, steadied a house that was listing, and let an entire community discover, at some cost to its own prior certainty, that the measure of a person had nothing to do with what could be seen on the surface of them. What the frontier remembered was simpler than any of that, in the end. It remembered that at Black Ridge Ranch that winter, a family that had been struggling to remain a family managed to do it. That a woman who had been defined by her scars became, instead, known for her hands, for what they could do, what they had sacrificed, what they built. That a ranch in the difficult country north of Hargrove found its way back to something that working land needs as surely as it needs good fences and reliable water, a reason to keep going. The year turned. Spring came, actual spring this time, with its mud and its noise and its frank insistence on being alive. The kitchen garden went in. The cattle were moved. The fence in the north pasture that had been giving trouble was finally, definitively, fixed. And Thomas was the one who drove the last post because he'd asked if he could, and Callum had handed him the hammer without a word. Lucy planted something in the corner of the kitchen garden that she refused to name until it came up. It turned out to be thyme. She ran to the kitchen to tell Marin, coming through the door at a speed that neither Marin nor Eleanor had managed to slow down for months because some kinds of energy are better accommodated than corrected. It came up, she said. Mine came up. Marin came to the doorway and looked at the garden. So it did, she said. It's mine, Lucy said, with the particular satisfaction of a child who has made something grow. It is, Marin said. Can we use it? When it's ready, Marin said. You'll know. Lucy went back out to look at it some more, and Marin stood in the kitchen doorway in the spring light with the smell of the garden coming through and the sound of the ranch doing its ordinary work in every direction, and she breathed it in. Not the life she had planned. She had stopped planning the life she wanted a long time ago, after the fire, after the years of other people's houses and other people's needs. She had stopped planning and started simply following what was in front of her, one day at a time, one kitchen at a time, one person at a time. It had brought her here. It turned out here was enough. More than enough. It was the thing that, if she was being honest with herself on a spring morning with the light coming through and a child in the garden and a family that was, against certain odds, intact, it was the thing she had been working toward without knowing it, through every difficult year and every hard place, and every morning she'd gotten up and kept going when the case for stopping was not without merit. She picked up the wooden spoon from the work table. She turned back to the stove. There was breakfast to make. There was always breakfast to make, and she was glad.